Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss what seems to be this week's cat amongst the pigeons unleashed by Keir Starmer. To say people had this view of the Labour leader as being a bit timid, he's certainly stoking discussions now. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So last week, Keir Starmer was pushing asylum policies. Is an interesting move because it's exactly what the Tories like talking about. And although it's an area where Labour have policies, they don't traditionally like wasting media bandwidth on them, preferring the economy, healthcare and education instead. But perhaps it's just a sign of Starmer's confidence that he feels he can take a Tory favourite talking point head on and come out the other end unscathed. If so, he was probably right. This week threatens to continue that asylum discussion, but then Keir Starmer has also been discussing something else, which the Conservatives tend to like to talk about, and the Labour Party have policies on, but has tended to avoid talking much about Brexit. And just as with asylum last week, seems to have set the cat amongst the pigeons again. That being said, I would suggest that it's less what Starmer's been saying and more the way certain media outlets have been presenting it. What's actually happened is that Keir Starmer has said that the Brexit deal is a load of rubbish and he wants to make it much better. Well, this is completely uncontroversial. Who on earth would seriously suggest that Keir Starmer should go into government going, oh, the Brexit deal, yeah, it's fine, we'll work with it. Madness. But I gather a BBC radio programme at least described it as Starmer wanting to rewrite the Brexit agreement. Hence cat introduced to pigeons. Cue all the people say, well, do you not think the EU might have a little say there? It's like, yes, of course. I'm being clear. Starmer has not been quoted anywhere as saying he's going to rewrite the agreement. Some journalists have who are not going to be involved in the discussions. Starmer hasn't even promised to improve the deal directly because, as should be obvious to everyone, it's not up to him. What Starmer is actually quoted as saying is that he will seek a major rewrite of the Brexit deal, that there needs to be further discussions. That's what he's actually said. And I will remind people that under Starmer, Labour have been holding discussions at various levels of the EU for 2 years now. We don't know what's been said. And I doubt there's been any agreements made, of course. The meetings will have been to make sure that both sides understand each other so that when talks begin in earnest, we don't waste a load of time trying to pursue something which is a complete non-starter. You know, Starmer is meeting President Macron tomorrow. This is intended as just such an exercise in mutual understanding on both parts. In terms of the actual news and statements, however, just as with the discussion on asylum last week, none of this represents a new policy. Starmer hasn't announced something new. It's just been amplified because Starmer is now talking about these issues himself. In terms of what he will be able to achieve, I have discussed this before, but it seems timely to go over it again. Being clear, we have a huge deficit with the EU when it comes to improving trade terms. I don't mean because the EU represents the larger market either. That's a given. The EU are applying full import controls on British products with, I suppose a small gap where Northern Ireland is concerned, whereas Britain is hardly applying any import controls to EU products at all. Now, the way trade negotiations work is you agree to lower your trade barriers a bit in return for the other side doing so for you. Well, our trade barriers are already really low, so our scope for that sort of negotiation with the EU is somewhat limited. And it is usually on that basis that people will dismiss the prospect for Labour to improve our trading agreement with the EU, who must generally be quite happy with the way things are at the moment. However, I've discussed in the past, and as Labour themselves alluded to earlier this year, that's quite a narrow-minded way of looking at it. Because we have this deficit in trade terms, it would be stupid to go to the EU and ask for better trading terms in isolation. In fact, the very people who are asking, yes, but what's in it for the EU, seem to be failing to ask that very question of themselves. What do the EU want? In trade terms, the EU wants to compete with China and the US. So any arrangements that mean that the UK can help the EU become more competitive with those other two huge economies will be appealing to the EU. but we've probably got limited scope for doing that. That is not the same as no scope, however. But outside of trade, then there's security. I said a while ago that Labour should tie talks on improving trade with talks on security cooperation. The EU say they don't want to do that. No, of course they don't want to do that, because that would then mean the UK has a little bit more leverage on trade than the EU would like. But what is the point of having talks on what are separate issues, but where one side in each of those talks isn't going to get what it really wants? Obviously, it's impossible to say what can be agreed once Labour in power. That's why Starmer can't promise to deliver the various things he wants, because you can't do that until you've had discussions and you've had an agreement. And we can't get that agreement at the moment because Starmer's not the Prime Minister. So we don't know what can be agreed. We don't know how quickly it can be agreed. There are some obvious improvements, like the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention. The veterinary agreement that Labour wants seems fairly uncontroversial. There will be discussions, but that one seems very doable. When it comes to things like mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or the sort of limited access to the single market for, say, performers, for example, yes, we're into more questionable territory there. But the fact that it is questionable and unlikely is not a reason not to pursue those discussions. And when it comes to what the EU would want in return, that's not up for Keir Starmer to say, is it? That's up for the EU to say. The other factor to bear in mind is that the EU is, and always has been, incredibly clear that what they do not want is for Britain to become a sort of Singapore on the Thames. Anyone who understands what the EU does should know that it wants as united a Europe as possible. This idea of Singapore on the Thames, it's something that the right-wing establishment want. It's what they thought Brexit would deliver. It's what they thought they were getting. It's why they're so crushed when Boris Johnson fell, because they thought he would deliver it. But it would be a massive pain for the EU. And the political reality where Brexit is concerned is as follows. When Labour come to power, they are going to seek a much closer relationship with the EU. They've said so. They've said so for a long time. If we get that much closer relationship, then we will work on a closer still relationship. Why would we stop? Because we're never going to get to the point where it says, right, we're fine now. We've got as much money as we want. No, we will keep going. And we will keep doing so until it becomes politically viable to broach the subject of applying to rejoin. Now, let us take the converse. Let us say Labour are unable to substantially improve our trading relationship with the EU. Then those calling for divergence will win. They'll say, well, it's not a debate about convergence or divergence. You can't get convergence. The EU have said no. So therefore, divergence is the only way. After all, if we don't have the option to work with the EU because the EU are refusing, and we obviously can't carry on as we are because everyone, rejoiners and leavers alike, everyone agrees that right now, the situation right now is crushing our economy. It's obvious. So if we can't converge, then we have no choice but to diverge, to become the thing that the EU desperately do not want the UK to become. That's Singapore on the Thames. So it's in the EU's interest that we get a much closer relationship with one another. Obviously, it can't be one-sided, but it is endlessly baffling to me when people saying that the UK won't be able to change much about our trading relationship with the EU. It's like the EU are in a perpetual state of negotiating with economies all around the world to do just that. Like, how on earth would it make sense to build a wall against the G7 economy on your doorstep and go to all that effort to negotiate closer trading ties with much smaller economies at the other side of the world? The scope for huge advances to be made under Labour is enormous. Don't worry that Starmer's just talking about the things that the UK wants rather than the EU. That's normal. Do you think the New Zealand government were talking about what the EU wants? No, they were talking about what they wanted. In negotiations, each side argues for what they want. And in this case, it's for the EU to say what it wants. It's not for Starmer to say, well, I think the EU wants this, because the EU could say, well, no, we don't want that. And that's what will happen in the discussions. David Lammy will show up for talks and say what the UK are interested in. The EU will say what they're interested in. That is how all negotiations work. Both sides, if sensible, we'll then work out where the common ground is. There'll be certain areas that are actually no-go areas after discussion, but then it's this common ground, and you move to there. And hopefully this has already been happening off the record to save time, because formal discussions have not begun yet, because Labour aren't in power yet. But the fact that talks have been ongoing for some time should be an obvious sign that there is scope for a lot of movement, where it is, of course, mutually agreeable. The alternative is a divided Europe, which is exactly what the Brexiteers want, including their brethren in continuing EU members and, of course, in the Kremlin. But it's not actually in the interests of anyone who wants a strong Europe. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships, and until next time, I'll see you later.